One of the things that has puzzled me throughout this crisis is with all the trouble that the European Union is having digesting its newest members, why they would think to bring on a basket case like Ukraine. And so economically, it doesn't really make sense for a European Union that has just itself getting out of its own crisis of the past few years. And so I wonder if the motives could be elsewhere, and I suspect that they are. Look at the European Union Association Agreement. First of all, it proposes what they call a deep and comprehensive free trade area, but it also has specific security and foreign policy protocols embedded within it. And I think that that's sort of the key, because if Ukraine was to follow, and they've since signed it this past June, that would put them on the road to NATO membership. And I think that the crisis really is being driven in part by the desire to put Ukraine into NATO. And that's sort of extraordinary given the really sort of defensive nature of the original iteration of NATO. I mean, after all, at the very beginning, Lord Ismay said the point of NATO was to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. And so that was a sort of defensive rationale. We're a long way from that now. But what strikes me when you hear American policymakers talk about this is that some of them genuinely still believe that NATO is a defensive alliance. But you couldn't possibly believe that given NATO's interventions in, say, Libya, for example, in 2011. And so I'm not sure if it's just naivete or cynicism, but there's something very wrong with the idea that the European Union and NATO have to expand to include almost, the entirety of the former Soviet space.
There was an agreement in the 80s. The Warsaw Pact states would be independent from the former Soviet Union, and NATO would not expand any further eastward.
And this wasn't written down. It wasn't a formal codified legal accord. There was no need to actually create a treaty stating that this would not be done. It was just obvious that, they would never be foolish enough to actually encroach upon the Warsaw Pact. And then, as we saw in 2004, not only taking in all of the Warsaw Pact nations for the most part, but then taking former Soviet territory as well. And then, of course, the movements that we saw in Georgia in 2008 made it appear as if Georgia was next in line. So this is what gave the Russian leadership, and Vladimir Putin specifically, tremendous pause regarding the United States' intentions. Now, again, we have to remember that this is how World War I started, where you had lots of nations that were all linked together in these kind of military alliances in which a war can break out in a relatively localized place, and then it can quickly erupt into something far more significant. We just have to be, I think, a little bit smarter and understand that from the Soviet perspective, from a country that was completely destroyed during a Great World War, losing over 20 million people, that seeing the advance of a military alliance onto its borders, no matter how benign it appears today, when you take a long view of history, of course, you understand that nothing is permanent. Everything and anything can change. What is today a benign alliance, if that is how one sees it, can become a hostile one under a different order and a different system. So we really pushed their limits of tolerance.
Yeah, there's a central irony in all of this. NATO was formed ostensibly to make Western Europe secure against any Soviet threat. And today, the aim of NATO is to make Europe insecure against a Soviet threat. Western Ukraine, by bombing the Donbass, by threatening to drive Russians out of Crimea, it was as if the Americans were trying to prod Putin into doing something intemperate. Look, Europe, the Russian bear is raising its head. It's going to invade again. By restarting the Cold War and by making these threats, NATO is making Europe much more insecure, not only militarily, but also economically.
Now, Alex, if I can just interject, I mean, whether it's malevolence, as Michael is suggesting in terms of this policy, or as I'm suggesting, just stupidity. the net effect is that NATO is a force for instability, and it's increasing the prospect for military conflict. And this is very, very dangerous. And Putin, for all of the misgivings that I have about him personally, is somewhat of a moderate when it comes to these foreign policy issues. I mean, I've met with some of the hardliners in Russia, people like Alexander Dugin and the rest. And if they had their druthers, they would have just gone in and taken over Ukraine, no questions asked. And so Putin actually is a restraining force on those elements within Russia.
We're told incessantly that this Ukrainian crisis and now the civil war that's destroying the eastern half of the country is solely Mr. Putin's doing. That simply isn't so. This all began with the rejection of the tripartite agreement that Mr. Putin proposed to Chancellor Merkel. One of the things that we forget is that Mr. Putin is surrounded by hawks himself. He's something of a moderate. He too is surrounded by high-level politics. He is not some modern-day czar like this ridiculous Frontline documentary that was just shown a few days ago. There are different competing interest groups within the Kremlin as well. And that's something that either policymakers in the United States are ignoring or they're ignorant of. But I can't believe that they're ignorant of.